Friends, please remain standing as we read from the gospel this morning. Our scripture reading comes from Mark chapter 5, verses 25 through 34. Listen now for a word from our Lord. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had, and she was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. For she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." Immediately her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she had been healed of her disease. Immediately aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said to Jesus, "You see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" He looked all around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before Jesus, and told him the whole truth. Jesus said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Please be seated. Throughout the month of September, we are in a short sermon series we're calling All the Good We Can. This is our mission series for this year. It's based on one of my favorite books about poverty alleviation and mission. It's called When Helping Hurts by Corbett and Fickert. That's a picture there. The first edition was so successful, they've subsequently released several other editions. This is the one I would commend to you. I think it's the 2012 edition, but it's the one with the black and white picture and the blue circle on it. The rest look very different than that. But I would commend that to you. It's very long, but it's worth the read if we want to see how we can do all the good we can. Now, last week we learned that poverty isn't first and foremost material. Sure, material poverty is a way of, it's just the surface level presenting issue, but poverty exists when something deeper is going on. In our book, Corbett and Fickert argue that the root cause of poverty is broken relationships. And they identify 4 primary foundational relationships that all of us have, every human being. That's our relationship with God, our relationship with ourselves, our relationship with others, and our relationship with the rest of creation. When all 4 of those relationships are intact, people begin to thrive. But when one or more of those primary foundational relationships is broken, poverty exists. Now, a poverty of relationship with God could be called the poverty of spiritual intimacy. We learned last week the importance of putting God first as the primary and foundational relationship in all of our lives, to love the Lord our God with all of our heart and all of our soul and all of our mind and all of our strength. When we put God first in our life, everything else just seems to make sense. But when that relationship is broken, it's hard to find our center. It's hard to see any transformation and change. And so we've got to work on that relationship first and foremost. Second, when the relationship with self is broken, we call that a poverty of being. I'm going to talk about that at length today, but I want to introduce you to the others. When our relationship with the world or the rest of creation is broken, we call that a poverty of stewardship. It's a failure to steward the good gifts of God in a way that work for us and for all. And we see brokenness coming from that. And the brokenness in our relationship with others is called a poverty of community. And so you can begin to see the interrelativity of all of these relationships in our lives and in the world. I want to introduce another concept to us around material poverty alleviation, and it's this. If we accept that poverty is rooted in relationships that do not work, that do not seek peace, and that don't lead to flourishing, then we begin to see that we are all impoverished in one or more of these key relationships. And so I would hold out before all of us that the mission of the church is lived out most effectively when we seek to heal relationships that are broken, and acknowledging that we all experience brokenness in our own lives and in the world. This is so important because very often in our efforts at mission and poverty alleviation, our temptation is to look at people as problems to be fixed. But what if the people aren't the problem, right? What if we begin to acknowledge a mutuality? See, last week when we learned to put God first in all of our lives, we realized that we have inherent dignity and value because of who God made us to be. We have worth because we were created in the image of God. And God created us to bear that image to the world. And so we do good to recognize God in each and every human being that we come into contact with. No matter what presenting issue they have in their own life, they are first and foremost a beloved child of God. We all know this, right? Right? We are all beloved children of God. I want you to say this. I don't do this often, but say, I am a beloved child of God. You are. And I don't want you to ever, ever forget it. Well, let's talk a little bit about the poverty of being. What does it mean to have a broken relationship with ourselves? And how does that manifest? If you've been in church for a while, you've probably heard Genesis 3. That's the story of the fall of humankind. We know of the temptation in that story where the serpent met with the woman, and God had commanded them not to eat of the fruit of this one tree, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. The serpent twists God's words and says, well, God didn't say that if you eat of this, you will die, but that your eyes will be opened and you'll be like God. And so the woman saw that the fruit was pleasing to the eye, and she took some and ate it and gave some to her husband, who also ate. This is one of the brokenness that comes from the poverty of self, or the poverty of being. It's the God complexes of those with material wealth. That is our ability to want to be like God, this temptation that all of us have that is rooted here in Genesis 3. And it's baked into our culture, right? If we're successful, if we've succeeded in life and in work, if we have material resources, the temptation is to think, my own work, my own value has amassed all of this for myself. But that's part of the poverty of being, right? It's askew. We shouldn't have a God complex. When that's working in a healthy way, we see that everything that we have is a gift from God. And it's not for us, for ourselves, to be hoarded, but it's to be stewarded and shared so that all might have enough. See, that's a healthy sense of self. The story in Genesis 3 continues, though, that they realized once they'd eaten of the fruit that they were naked. And so they hid. And God came walking through the garden in the cool of the day and asked, "Where are you?" And Adam responds to God, "Well, we were naked, so we hid." And God says, "Who told you that you were naked?" This is the other side of a poverty of being. It's shame. And what does shame cause us to do? Shame causes us to hide from God, to hide from others, to hide from ourselves, and it robs us of being all that God has called us to be. I want to share a story that is in the book about a woman named Mary. Her story is extraordinary, and it tells us about the poverty of relationship and how it manifests. Mary lives in a slum in western Kenya. And as a female in a male-dominated society, she has been subjected to polygamy and subject to regular physical and verbal abuse from her husband. She has fewer years of schooling than her male counterparts, and she lives in a cultural system that tells her that she is inferior. And so Mary's poverty of being manifests itself in a lack of confidence to look for a job, to fully integrate into the broader society. This leads to the presenting issue of material poverty. But Mary is desperate for a means to produce income to support her and her family. And so she decides to be self-employed, but she doesn't have the resources to start a business. So she goes to the only place that she can get a loan, that's a loan shark that charges her 300% on her loan of $25, further contributing to her material poverty. She wants to start a business of selling homemade charcoal in the local market. But the problem is that hundreds of others also sell charcoal, which drives the price down. Mary will never gain enough income from the sale of charcoal to pay back her exorbitant loan that is growing by the moment. She doesn't see that she can sell something else because she does not understand that God has given her the creativity and capacity to have dominion over creation. So her poverty of stewardship locks her into an unprofitable business, which further contributes to her material poverty. So frustrated by her entire situation, Mary goes to the local healer, who tells her that she has to buy a bull to sacrifice in order to see her situation turn around, which comes at a considerable financial cost, further exacerbating the issue of material poverty. So you see that Mary is suffering from having a lack of sufficient income, but it's rooted in the brokenness of these four primary relationships. Shame leads us to having low self-esteem. And it takes somebody who is willing to not exploit a vulnerable person, but to name their inherent value and worth, to point to their great giftedness given by God in order for them to become all that they can be. I have a personal example of this, a time that somebody pointed out something in me that I couldn't see for myself, and it changed my life. When I was in 6th grade, I met Richard Longoria. He was my band director, and I had taken up the saxophone and was a part of beginning band. And I saw something good in him. He was a good man. He cared deeply about his students. He brought out the very best in all of us. Well, when I became a 7th grader, we had the opportunity to try out for all-region band. And so I know the deadline was published, and I weighed the choice and ultimately made up my mind that I wasn't going to make it. I wasn't good enough, and so I didn't sign up. Well, Mr. Longoria called me the day after the deadline. He said, as all the students were exiting class, he said, "Lance, stick around for a moment. I want to talk to you." And I thought, oh, goodness, I'm in trouble. And so I stayed, and he said, "Lance, I noticed the deadline has passed for all-region band and that you didn't sign up." I said, "That's right." He said, "Why not?" I said, "Because I don't think I'm good enough. I don't think I can make it." He said, "You are good enough. I believe you can make it. I will help you, and I signed you up. You're going." And would you know, he made good on that promise to me. He made sure that we had set up times for me to come in after school to practice my tryout music with him. I got on the bus that morning and went to tryouts, and I made all-region band. And I never would have taken that step if he hadn't pointed out to me that I could do it. I had never believed in myself enough to take the chance. My confidence was low. I suffered from a poverty of being. But he saw something in me that I didn't see in myself, and he knew it. And he brought out the very best in me. I could never have done that without him. Think about a time that somebody's done something like that for you, encouraged you, literally encouraged you to do something beyond anything you thought you could do before. Maybe a teacher or a mentor at work, maybe a parent or a grandparent. And think about the ways that it changed your life. Now think about how you could do that for somebody else, countless others. You see, in the context of the sermon series, when we look at a person who lives in some type of material poverty, they might present different than you and I do in our daily lives. But when we can see the other as somebody who has been given inherent value by God, who is a precious son or daughter of God, who has been given gifts by God to do something that only they can do in the way God created them to do it, and we can point that out for them, we begin to see those two primary relationships healed and lives begin to change. You see that? Take our story in our gospel reading today, for example. The story of the woman with the issue of blood. If you watch The Chosen, this story was featured in one of the episodes, and it may be my favorite of all of the episodes. The story was so touching. This woman, for 12 years, had been bleeding. And she had gone to every doctor who would see her, and she had exhausted all of her financial resources trying to be healed. Nothing worked. Add to that by law in her culture, by the very virtue of bleeding, that rendered her unclean. So everything and everyone that she touched was also rendered unclean. What did this mean? It means that she and everyone that she came into contact with would be unable to worship, to be a part of the religious life of the community. So what happened as a result? This woman had to live outside the community. In The Chosen, they show her living in a tent by herself, literally living a nomadic life, camping. Well, one day she heard that this man, Jesus of Nazareth, was nearby. She had heard that he had healed many and that he was changing the world. And she believed that Jesus could do for her what none of those physicians had been able to do. But remember, this woman suffered from a poverty of being. She lacked self-confidence because she had been ostracized in society. She knew that people knew of her condition and that she was considered unclean to be in public. And so she waited until she heard a crowd gathering around Jesus, and she entered the city. And as Jesus was walking along, she reached through the legs of the crowd and touched the fringe of Jesus' garment, because she believed if she only touched Jesus' clothes, that she would be made better, that her bleeding would stop, and that she would be healed. She did just that, and she was, in fact, healed. Jesus knew that power had gone out from him, and he was not willing to let this go. You know why? Because the healing had not been made complete. Sure, her bleeding had stopped, but she hadn't been fully healed. So Jesus stops walking, and he says, "Who touched me?" And I love the way in which the Gospels narrate this. You can almost hear the disciples laughing. They say, "Jesus, you're in a crowd of people. Literally everyone is touching you. Why would you ask such a silly question?" is the implication, right? And I imagine Jesus kind of smiled in that moment. He said, "Y'all, power has gone out from me. Someone has experienced physical healing, and I want to meet this person. So I ask again, who touched me?" Realizing that she could hide no more, she comes timidly before Jesus and says, "It was me." And I want you to notice something about this text. At the top, she was called woman. How does Jesus name her at the end of the story? How? Calls her daughter. This woman who has lived on the very margins for over a decade probably hasn't been called by name in a long time, probably hasn't been called anything that would constitute a connection or a relationship. But what does Jesus call her? Daughter. My beloved child. Someone of infinite worth and value in my eyes and in God's eyes. Your faith has made you well. Wow. Sometimes people just need to be reminded of their belovedness, don't they? In order to experience the true healing that comes from God. That, my friends, can change and transform everything. But we have to remember that we're all experiencing brokenness in our lives in some way. That's the way in which we enter deeply into relationship with somebody else. Again, we don't recognize the other as a problem to be solved or something to be fixed, but we recognize in them someone who is a beloved child of God, who lives and experiences brokenness in a way that may be different than you and I, but that is also similar, because we know the world is not working in the way that God fully intends. When we realize this, and when we put people first, because we put God first in mission, it changes everything. Let me tell you one more story as I begin to bring this to a close. This story is narrated in the book, and it's about a church called Creekside Community Church that's physically located near an apartment complex that has people of lower socioeconomic status living in it. One year, the pastor, the story is told, approaches his board and says, "Hey, I want to deliver Christmas presents for the children who live in this nearby apartment complex." And so he gets the congregation fired up, and they do what you do. You know, you go and you knock on doors, and you get the wish list from the children, and you put some, like an angel tree out, and people pick up an ornament with the list and buy the presents, and then they're delivered. They did it year one. They felt really, really good about themselves. And if we're being honest, it fed the God complexes of those who help. You know, look at the good that we did, right? And they did this year after year after year. After about year 5, the pastor noticed that after the deadline, the list still remained on the tree. Some had been picked up, but not all. And he had to really work hard to make sure that all the list and all the children got presents. And then he noticed that it became more and more difficult to get people to deliver the presents. And so he began to ask around, why aren't we as enthusiastic about this as we once were? I thought y'all were excited about this. And nobody would speak up. But finally, somebody came forward and said, "You know, we've gotten tired. You ever had compassion fatigue, where you're just spent from helping, right?" That's what had happened. And the people said, "We're exhausted. Year after year after year, we buy these gifts and we go and deliver them and we go into these homes and nothing changes for them. Their situation remains the same. And we've noticed that the fathers are completely absent. We don't want to continue to just throw good things at bad, right? If it's not working, we want to abandon it." Well, the authors of the book point out the root cause of what's going on. There's a poverty of being here. You've got the God complexes of those who thought they were doing great, right, and felt really good about it, that mixed with the poverty of being or the lack of self-esteem or shame in the lives of those that were helping. The narrators say that the pastor failed to realize, but then quickly learned, that the fathers were present in the home, but in their community had trouble keeping and maintaining work because of the conditions that existed as a poverty of stewardship or failure of creation. And so every year, these fathers would see people of, middle or upper classes coming and bringing gifts to their children that they couldn't provide for their own families, and they would sneak out the back doors before the doorbell would ring because of the sense of shame that they felt. It looks like a different approach is needed. In this book, When Helping Hurts, the authors lift up 3 types of poverty alleviation. The first is relief. Imagine a hurricane where there's a flood, and after the flood, people come in and provide food. They muck and gut the houses to get the wet drywall out and get all the wet furniture and things out. They're given shelter temporarily until more help can come. Next is rehabilitation. That's getting life back to where it was before the tragedy, right? Rebuilding the home to the place that it was. The last piece is development. This is where things improve beyond what they were before the tragedy itself. And the authors argue that you shouldn't apply relief and rehabilitation where development is needed. When you do more harm than good. Creekside Community Church was providing relief when what they should have been doing, if they really wanted to make a difference, do all the good they can, is they needed to be developing relationships with those families, connecting with them, seeing them as fellow sons and daughters of the King, and helping them see their inherent value and worth. One of the greatest examples of this approach is Zoe Empowers. Zoe began going into African countries and places where mothers and fathers were dying from AIDS, and they would go to children who found themselves raising their younger siblings. These are kids 12 and 13 years of age who were left without mothers and fathers and the means to support themselves. And Zoe went in, this was based on this model, and they would help the children develop a dream plan. So Zoe partners with local churches all over the world to provide some nominal working capital as a no-interest loan to help a child begin a business that can begin to produce income for their household. So Zoe comes in year one, gets a cohort from a community and says, we're going to help you develop a dream plan. What are the gifts that God has given you? What are you passionate about? Where do you feel you could make a difference in the world? And so a child might say, well, I love making spices, or I love raising chickens, or I love making baskets. Great, let's turn that into a business. So by the end of year one, children have made enough to pay back their loan, and they do. Year two, after the loan is paid back, they begin to raise their own working capital and multiply their business. And year three, they contribute to Zoe so that another cohort of children can begin in year one. That's an example of this approach changing lives in a way that restore what is truly broken. Friends, that's my dream, that we would do all the good we can, that we would realize what approach is needed when, that we would be about developing relationships with those who are living in situations different than our own, that we would help them see their own value and worth in God's eyes and in ours too, that we would help them claim and use their gifts to improve their own situation, and that then we would be a part of helping them pour into the world around them so that they could be a blessing too. With God's help, we can and we will make this kind of difference.